the session today. That way, if someone has to drop off early, we'll be able to get you the recording. So welcome everyone to today's session on ransomware. I appreciate y'all joining. This is Ted Sherrill, president of the Houston chapter of ISACA. We've had a lot of requests around ransomware and getting more information on it. And I've been working diligently on this for a couple of weeks and looking at a lot of other webinars and trying to determine how we could do bringing something a little bit different today and maybe more actionable. There's a lot of information on this. I'm sure many of you saw the report on 60 Minutes on CBS, and so there's been a lot of shows on TV and tons of information on the internet and a lot of webinars, etc. So I am going to be, I'm joined today by Lisa Rogers, and she had the joyful experience of actually living through one of these events. So she's going to share that experience with us and kind of help kick it off and set the stage. So we'll get to that in just a minute. But let me quickly highlight just a little bit of housekeeping. So one of the things I'm going to work diligently to do for you today is avoid some of the fluff. I know that there's politics around this and countries talking to countries, etc. But if you're like me, I can't really do much about that. That's way outside of my abilities. So I needed to know, what could I do? And one of the things that I was felt a little frustrated about with some of the webinars that I watched on ransomware was I felt like there could be more meat in it, if you will, and actionable items. So hopefully you'll feel that you get that out of this. And I'm going to share some observed best practices. And again, there is no silver bullet for this. I want to be clear. This is a very, very formidable enemy that we face, whether it's from a nation state, whether it's particular hacking groups, etc. You are going to get a taste today if you haven't dealt with ransomware before. I will highlight for you how sophisticated some of this is. Again, I'm not saying that to scare you. I think we're all aware of how prevalent this is. And today's webinar is for cybersecurity professionals. And so most of you are very aware of this. And like I said, there's not one single defense like antivirus or something like that that's going to be completely effective against this. If it was, let's be honest, we wouldn't be having the attacks we're having. So the hackers continue to evolve and find new ways to compromise. And I also want to call out, even though this is ISACA, there are organizations such as SIM, ISC Squared, etc., that also have information, webinars, etc., that can assist you in this. So you're not alone. And I think the fact that you're here today, the fact that we have over 150 people on right now, like I said, we're all in this together. And so I also welcome your feedback and suggestions. So just again, a little bit of housekeeping. I put some information out in chat. We are recording the webinar, and I will have a polling question that'll pop up in a minute that will ask if you'd like to get a copy to the replay, as well as a copy of the presentation with a lot of the links and the definitions, etc. Some of the slides in the presentation I just, had to put in the appendix. I could not fit everything in to the session today. So when I send it out to you, there will be additional content in there as well. And we may mention particular products or companies, but that doesn't mean that we're endorsing them. We're just trying to use examples to help. And again, for CPE credits, you do get CPE credit for attending this. So starting at 12 noon Central Time, your timer starts. You get a half a CPE for every 30 minutes, 1 CPE credit for every 50 minutes. I'm not for sure how long this is going to go today. I know at least an hour. Again, if you have to drop early, that's okay. You'll get CPE credit for the time that you attended. But like I said, And if you have questions, please feel free to reach out to us. And if you do drop early, if you do select that you want a copy of the link to the recording out on YouTube, I'll send that link to you and you'll be able to watch the remainder that you miss. If you have questions, please submit them through the Q&A. I worked at, when I send the emails back out with the presentations, to list the questions that we received along with written responses. If you do not want your question shared, maybe it's sensitive or something like that, just state that you opt out and then I will not include it. But we all learn from each other. So that's why I try to share the question and answers when we can. I will work to get to answering some of the questions at the end of the session today. But again, that just depends on how long we go, the nature of the question, etc. But please submit them through the Q&A. And again, if you're having technical difficulties, I do have my right-hand person on, our administrator, Jean Swan, for the ISACA Houston chapter. And you can send a chat to the panelist and she'll look to see if she can help you. But most likely, we, like I said, you might want to go to support.zoom.us. So the agenda for today: 1, know thy enemy, ransomware, assess your environment, identify gaps using control frameworks, some best practices, and then a case study actually highlighting specific controls around prevention, detection, and recovery. And kind of putting it into action, if you will. So this really, I felt like was an agenda that would take you all the way from better understanding, especially with Lisa sharing her experience, how does ransomware attack, etc. And I've got some slides that highlight that. What is a typical experience? And then how to assess your environment to know where you may be vulnerable. The US government provides complimentary, means free, not only tools to help you assess your environment, they'll actually assist you. And I've spoken to them a couple of times and they're very helpful. So, I think you'll be pleased to find what you can do there. You may be already assessing some of your environment, but there's other areas you might feel like you need to further assess, and that could help you. Again, looking at control frameworks, obviously things like ISACA, the COBIT framework, but the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, they use the NIST and the MITRE ATT&CK framework a lot, and I'll be covering those as well. And then we'll talk about, they actually do have, the CISA has some documented best practices for ransomware. We're going to cover those. And like I said, then we'll get into the case study. So, and actually show you how it's applied with specific technologies and controls. So I think this will, I'm pretty excited about this. I'm hopeful that this will give you something actionable that when you leave, that you'll actually be able to potentially, if needed, do assessments, maybe utilize control frameworks to validate the severity of a finding, look at what some best practices are for remediation, and understand an example of controls that can be utilized to help you around prevention, detection, and recovery. And it is exactly that. At the end of the day, we're working to try to prevent what we can. When we can't prevent it, or we're not able to, we want to detect it and contain it. And then we want to be able to recover as fast as humanly possible. That is the real key, and we'll talk about that. So with all that being said, Lisa, thank you so much for joining us today. And I've got a few of your slides that talk about your experience, and I'm going to hand it over to you, and then I'll periodically pose some questions to you as we go along through this.
Great. Thank you, Ted. I appreciate it. Yes, we lived through a ransomware attack a couple of years ago. It was it hit a week before Thanksgiving in 2019. But when I first started at the company, I came into a very old environment. So that was immediately a red flag. I knew that there was a lot of work we needed to do to get up to speed. We had obsolete firewalls. We had obsolete Dell switches. We were running our email on a 2007 exchange and a 2003 server. We had a 2000 server in our environment. Most of the workstations were Windows 7, but we still had quite a few XPs in the environment as well. And we were running Office 2010. The one saving grace is our primary EMR system. It was a doctor's office. So our primary EMR system was hosted by somebody else. It was housed at the Switch data center in Las Vegas, and which we accessed through Citrix. But then we had a lot of on-prem servers doing our radiology and other critical and things, critical software. So that was sort of the environment I walked into. If you want to progress the slides, Ted. So that was the environment. Go one more. So the way the attack happened, this particular attack, it was a Ryuk attack, if anybody's heard of that. But it started off with an email that hit us that came in to everybody, and it was from somebody inside the company responding to the last email you sent her. So it looked like it was her just responding to you, and it was attached to a Word document. And the first sign of trouble was when people came in to me and said, Estelle sent me this Word document, but when I click on it, nothing happens. So we immediately sent out notification, changed Estelle's email, blocked it, told anybody get something from her, do not open the attachment. If you did try to open the attachment, let us know. And the people who let us know, we checked, and our endpoint software had found the virus and had quarantined it. So we thought we had dodged the bullet there, but then the next day, Ryuk started showing up, and it came in and attacked the PCs, and we thought we cleaned it up. We thought we got it done and contained, and then the next morning it came back again, and that time it went straight for our SQL server, went straight for our databases, any kind of data repository, and started encrypting. And that was when we got the remediation firm involved. Interestingly, we were hit 3 weeks after we signed for our cyber insurance. And it was the ransom was exactly what our policy limit was. So I'm convinced, no proof, but I'm convinced that they had been in our email for some time watching. And when we signed for the cyber insurance, that's when they hit. So, and on one hand, we were protected, but on the other hand, the protection may have caused the problem. You go to the next slide, please. So at the end of the day, the forensics showed that the phishing email had made it through on the XP computers. The 7 computers, it was blocked, but not on the XP computers. And those people didn't fess up to having clicked on the attachment. So that's where it came in. Once it got in, it started looking around for another way into our system. And of course, it found the 2003 server. It found the 2000 server. It says, this is an easy one. Sent back a message to command and control. Command and control sent in the payload. And then that's what hit us the next day. And it started the attack. So it was a sort of a 2-pronged attack, started with the phishing email, and then they were able to get command and control inside. Now, at the time, we did not, it was not a breach because they did not exfiltrate the data. If it had, it would have been a HIPAA breach, and we would have been in a much more serious position. And I understand that today they're adding that aspect to it, but we were not breached. It was just encrypted, and we did not have to pay the ransom because of our backups. And there was no data loss, with one exception, with one doctor who was doing his own thing and didn't have any backups. And we didn't even know what he was doing. But for the most part, we were okay. But the thing that they don't really talk, I've never heard about in terms of a ransom attack. I kind of said, well, they encrypt your data, you have good backups and you get your data back, or you pay the ransom and you get the encryption key, whatever, and then you're back up and running. It destroyed every computer in the system. It destroyed the profiles on them, and every single server and endpoint had to be rebuilt from scratch. So we had to install Windows all over again, install the software. The servers were all brought from backup.
Yeah,
But my endpoints were such that every doctor had, over the 20 years, had been allowed to bring in whatever he wanted for a laptop. So we had all kinds of different computers in the system, all different. We had some that were Windows Home, some of them were Windows Pro. You know, it just was, some of them were Mac. It was just all over the board, which made that kind of a nightmare.
Yeah, Lisa, if I can ask you a question real quick. Your point about that, I think, is a really good one, because one, I think most of us attending know that, you know, data backups are key. One of the things that I think a lot of people are not as aware of, if you look at, just to your point about having to re-image everything, if you look at the Maersk, not Petya, infiltration that they had over 40,000 laptops and desktops, et cetera, that they had to re-image. And I believe over 4,000 or 4,500 servers that they had to re-image. You can imagine the task that is. And my point in saying this, and I wanted to, you know, ask this in a question, is it brings to light, not only do you need the data backed up, but you need your configurations backed up so that you can quickly, you know, redeploy, you know, VM images or et cetera. And when you're talking thousands of potentially, you know, desktop servers, et cetera, I just wanted to get your thought on, did y'all have configuration backups? And maybe you can expand on that a little bit.
No, we did not. So every PC was a one-off. Now, what we did in the process of restoring is my 6-month plan to upgrade to Windows 10 took 4.5 days. So we just got a lot of people in there. We narrowed down all the desktops to 4 current versions we were using from Dell. And if you didn't have that version, we replaced your computer. You got a new computer, because a lot of the computers were so old they wouldn't take Windows 10.
Right.
So you got a new computer, and we were able to standardize the computers, bring everybody up to Windows 10, bring everybody to Office 365, Outlook. So we got all that done during the restoration, but we had no, and you'll see that in lessons learned, we had no configuration management. It was just, and we had nothing like roaming profiles or anything equivalent to that. And people in the clinical areas moved around all the time. You may have clinic in this place one day and that place the next day. And every person, their printers, their scanners, their, you know, everything had to be set up for each person each time they touched a new computer, which is, I mean, it took us 2 or 3 months to get that sorted out. And we were only talking about 350 people and maybe 500 computers. So if you're talking what you're talking, I mean, it would be, you know, there would be no way of doing it. You know, we had to augment staff for a while and just get it done. But that was definitely something that we learned, is there was no configuration management, no easy way to get these computers back up and running. The servers we were okay, because we were just able to roll them back out again. And the VMs were, you know, backed up and that kind of thing. So we were better off in the server from a server point of view than we were from an endpoint point of view.
Okay, great. Thanks for that.
Okay. So if you go to the next slide for the lessons learned, first of all, we had Linux backups. So our backups were to a Linux appliance that was on site, and then from there to the cloud. And that saved us, because if they had been Windows backups, it would have been encrypted just like everything else. So that's something that I will certainly take with me to my grave, that my backups will always be on a totally separate operating system from whatever we're running in the business, because that really did save us. Keeping everything current. I mean, everybody knows you need to patch and you need to keep things current. They didn't. They never did security updates. They never did. I mean, they never even upgraded their computers. You know, when I tried to get them to go to Windows 10, they went, well, why should I pay for this monthly? Why can't I just buy Windows 10 and run it for 20 years like we did Windows 7? You know, well, because Microsoft figured out they can't stay in business doing that. So they're doing it differently now. You can't buy it for 20 years and not do it again. And so it was a hard sell to the doctors to get them to understand, when you're end of life and you're not getting security updates, what does that mean? And I remember one doctor told me, he says, well, we don't use the XP computers very often. We just view x-rays in the patient rooms. That's all we use it for. And I said, yes. And so how big does a cut have to be before it infects your entire body? So if those things are on the network, we're vulnerable. So hardware and software has got to be kept up to date. We had some business continuity in place, like we always printed 5 days of schedules. This clinic saw maybe 600 patients a day, so it was a pretty high volume. And we kept schedules, like 5 days of printed schedules ahead. We only had to run manually one day without any technology. One day, one Friday, we shut everything down. By Monday, we had enough brought back up that they could limp through electronically. But we had the printed schedules, but what we didn't have is patient summaries. So the doctor knew that so-and-so was showing up, but didn't know what he was showing up for. Did I just do surgery on them? Are they coming for a follow-up visit? Unless they happened to remember the person, they didn't have patient summaries. So over the weekend, we worked at a way of getting into our data, pulling out the patient summaries, creating PDFs, and then developing a secure method to get those to the doctors. So on Monday, they would have, in case we weren't back up on Monday. And then the other thing is when they couldn't collect credit cards electronically, they just didn't. The staff didn't. And it shows that if you walk away from a doctor's office without paying the bill, there's about a 40% chance you never will pay the bill. There's about a 40% loss of revenue if it's not paid at the time that you are there. And so there was certainly a way that they could have gotten credit card information and still done it. But they didn't know how to do that, and it hadn't been documented. So those were the two big holes in terms of business continuity, were patient summaries and how to take credit cards. Standardizing the IT equipment and images. We talked about that just briefly before. You can't just let everybody do their own thing and have, 500 computers and 500 configurations. They were only backing up our EMR data in the data center once a day. And so we ended up losing 4 hours of data, which the doctors just rekeyed in. They had the notes, but there was no reason for that. I mean, it was a SQL database. You can do replication of that and have, real-time backup. So we changed that. And doctors' personal laptops. They brought in personal laptops, and when I say Fondernize them, that means that we managed them. We would put on our antivirus software. By that time we had bought Cisco Umbrella. That would have to be on it. You had to let us put those things on your laptop. And if you didn't want us, a lot of doctors says, no, I don't want you putting that stuff on my laptop. Well, then you can't be on our network. You can go on the guest network, but you can't be on our network unless we can do something with your computers. Because that was an interesting thing. On Monday morning, we had to put every entrance to the building had to be staffed, and we took doctors' laptops away from them as they walked in. Because if they were in the office on Thursday and Friday, we had no way of knowing their laptops weren't compromised. And they wouldn't have been something we would have tagged over the weekend because they had them at home. So we actually physically took them away from the doctors, checked them out, made sure they were clean before we gave them back to them and let them use them. We were implementing Intune for the standardized PC setup, just so that there's no way to really what we were doing. And then the roaming profile or some equivalent solution, because that was craziness trying to keep all those profiles up. So those are the big things we learned. The good news that came out of it is that we were all Windows 10 by the time it was over, and no server that was end of life was allowed back on the network. And so, they had to, especially the X-ray machines that were XP, we had to isolate them from the network completely and come up with a different way of doing things, because they couldn't replace the XP without replacing a $250,000 X-ray machine. So, but we had no XPs on the system. We actually physically removed their network cards from them, so they couldn't be on the network. And we were much more standardized and much more secure when it was all done, but it was a very painful couple of months to live through.
No, that's helpful. A couple of questions that
Mhm.
people have submitted. One, what was your, how long were systems down?
We were completely down that Friday, and then we worked overnight over the weekend to get the one EMR system back up and running. They restored that one in the data center, and we were back on that. But I had other doctors. There were 4 other EMR systems that didn't want to use the primary one and had their own, and I moved them to the cloud. And I had them moved pretty much over the weekend too. They were back up and running Monday or Tuesday on their EMRs. So we only had one day that the EMR was down. Then it took us another week after Thanksgiving we got enough endpoints back up that there could be at least one working computer per pod, which is where our doctor would see patients. The building was divided into various pods that patients would see, doctors would see patients, and we had at least one working computer in every pod by the time Monday morning came down. So we were able to limp along a bit, but it was the roaming profiles and things like that. They did not know how our credit card system was a web-based system, but they did not know how to get to that website without an icon being on their desktop. But one of the things we had to do was wipe out a profile, put on a clean profile that allowed them to limp through and then the ones we couldn't do that, we re-imaged and then we replaced. And it took us about a week after that to do all of the computers in the system. But, we had people who didn't know how to get to that website when there wasn't an icon on their desktop that you push for credit cards. You couldn't say, hey, just go to www. That was beyond them. So we were a lot of just hand holding, trying to get them back, but we ran manually for one day.
Okay. And then one more question, and then I'm going to have to hold the rest of them. But how did you, with such a rapid change, how did you manage the change element? Like, how were people trained on Office 365 or the new Windows version, et cetera?
I was not a nice control change process, that's for sure. But the attack impacted everybody. And even that weekend when we were trying to find out what computers could we put back, could we clean up enough to put back, we had people from all departments coming in to help. We just gave them instructions and said, do this. So, everybody from the president of the company to people that do process insurance claims to whoever was willing came in and helped out. So there was a lot of willingness in the company to deal with the changes, to deal with, I when it was all done, I sent an email out to everybody thanking them for their patience as we did this. And this was certainly not the way we wanted to roll out all this new technology, but we really appreciate the fact that they just kind of took the horns, and made it happen. A lot of people, they used Windows 10 at home, so it wasn't that big a deal. It was the frontline people who were taking credit cards and that were a little less computer literate that we had to hold hands. But then I just I had a guy come in early every day so that when billing started and check-in started, we had a guy there helping them hold their hands. So it was sort of on the job training and on the fly, because it was fast but it didn't make sense to re-image the computers back to what they were.
Right.
And we had so much issues with those computers, and we had DPOs that were stomping on each other and lots of other problems that the guy from the remediation company on Saturday, we thought we had the formula for getting some of the computers up and running. And then he came in on Sunday morning and he goes, this computer was hit again. And I said, oh my God, how did that happen? I thought we had it cleaned up. And he said, well, I turned it on and it took 5 minutes to boot up. And we had to laugh and say, yeah, well, that's standard. That's what, in our system, that's how long it takes to boot up a computer. So it was,
Right.
it was, it made no sense to go back to that, right? As long as we were going to have to re-image every computer, let's go ahead and do the Office 365 and just bite the bullet and handhold people and help them through the change.
So, and I heard you mention this, and it kind of sets up where I'm going with the presentation. On your servers, how did, you mentioned you thought that they had laid in wait for a while within your systems.
Mhm.
And when you took out the cyber insurance, they saw the email and then they struck.
Mhm.
And that is a key point that I want to get over to our participants today is they lay in wait until the most inopportune time or the most opportune for them. But to your point, how, since that you are suspect that they had been in your system a while, how did y'all know that the images you were going back to on your servers were clean images?
Because they came in from the backup. And then remember I said that the backups were to a Linux appliance. And this attack only hits Windows.
Okay.
And so they weren't able to encrypt the Linux. So that's what gave us good backups. And that's really what saved us. That's what I said earlier. I'll always have my backups now be a completely different operating system from whatever I'm running primarily, because a lot of these attacks are target, Windows, or they're, Apple hasn't yet gotten where they're being attacked for Apple, but they're usually pretty specific to the operating system. So
Right.
by having the Linux appliance, then I knew our backups were good.
Right. So that's a kind of form of, and we'll talk about this, of segmenting,
Mhm.
or isolation or whatever you want to call it, but segmenting operating systems so that, that's one way to do it. We'll talk about network segmentation, et cetera. But that can really help contain and limit your exposure to this.
Mhm.
And I think that's a real key takeaway. It's a CISA best practice that they talk about. So we'll be talking about that. But Lisa, thank you for this. Sorry you had to live through it, but at least if there's lemonade out of lemons, you could share this with our participants today and we can all learn from it and go forward. So really appreciate you taking the time to do that with us.
My pleasure, Ted. My pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Looking forward to the rest of the presentation.
Thanks. Yeah, unfortunately, you've lived a lot of it. So, exactly.
Got the t-shirt.
Yeah, you got the t-shirt. So speaking of that, we're gonna jump into this, but as I do, before we get into diving into the ransomware and how it attacks, et cetera, let me, I mentioned to y'all I would launch a poll, and I want to do this now. So if you would like us to send you a copy of the materials today, or the link to the webinar, please opt in or out. We don't want to spam people with their emails. Not that we would do that, but we don't want to send you the information if you're not interested. I know we haven't been through all of the materials yet, but if you'd like a copy, please let us know, and I'll leave that up just for a second. And while that's going, let me stop my video. And I will post this again at the end of the session today. So if you missed it or whatever, we'll repost it. So let me, I'm going to end that poll and we're going to get started with the next section real quick. So I felt like this was an appropriate costume for what we're fixing to get into. So Lisa did a great job of telling you how fun and exciting this experience can be. And so I thought the Guy Fawkes mask would be appropriate for this, along with the black cowboy hat. So anyway, and most of y'all are probably familiar with black hat, white hat type of scenarios. So let's get into it and look at. I did, this is a war that's going on, so I figured who better than one of the greatest generals of all time to quote, and that if you do not know your enemy or yourself, you will succumb in every battle. And that's what we're trying to help you with somewhat today, is how do you know yourself better, and also how do you know the enemy? And so let's take a look at that. So for very quickly, and I'm gonna very quickly on the e-crime ecosystem, understanding that there is things like malware as a service, ransomware as a service, and these are professional hackers that gain access to your system, and they basically sell that access where they keep 75% roughly of the ransom, and then the person that the has the ransomware that they're delivering, the malware, if you will, then that person will get 25% of the ransom. So this is very profitable industry for people that just professionally hack into systems. And secondly, once they're in, they get in through social networking, spamming, email, just like Lisa was talking about, and then they monetize it. They work to extrapolate money through Bitcoin, etc. So I'm gonna remove my mask so you can hear me a little bit easier, but I'll keep the black hat on. So, so let's look at, this is just an example of a couple of images that have popped up from ransomware that, speak to your files being encrypted and what you need to do. And, I'm going to show you in just a second where we can kind of dissect this malware and ransomware via malware and give you a good indication of what it is. But first, let's quickly talk about, again, and I know there's a lot of information about this, but 85% of the breaches are estimated to come from a known vulnerability out of the common vulnerability enumeration, the CVE database, etc. The hackers are exploiting the fact that it can take a while to patch systems. So the Verizon report, the data breach investigation report, if you haven't read it, I recommend it. They do a very good job of highlighting that almost all of the breaches that they analyze and study, there was a patch available for it. It's just a matter of getting it applied and implemented in time. The $220,000 is the average ransomware payment. The one that really sticks out to me on this page is the 23 days of system downtime due to an attack. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but believe me, for your critical systems, that, whether it's 23 or 2 days, that could be absolutely catastrophic. And some organizations have actually gone out of business due to ransomware attacks. And then, every 11 seconds, it's estimated that there is a ransomware attack. So it's become very prevalent. If we look here for ransomware payments by quarter, you can see it's a profitable business. And if this was a stock, you might think that it was a Bitcoin stock or a cryptocurrency stock, because it is, those are pretty good growth rates for, payments. I'd be negligent to say that, of course, the US Treasury has come out especially for paying some terrorist groups, etc., some groups that are on the watch list, that they do not want organizations paying ransom payments to those. And then there's also, on the bright side, if you do pay a ransom, this hasn't been fully clarified, but it looks like that the IRS may allow you to deduct some of that ransomware payment. But again, that would be up to your tax professional, but but it looks like that might be allowed for as a loss. But again, your tax professionals would know best. But keep in mind, you do have to work with the proper government agencies, et cetera, to know what your appropriate plan is. I think just as Lisa was talking about, and the CISA says this, have a plan, know who to call in case you are have an attack. One of the things I did run across in listening to some of the podcast and webinars is that some of the agencies employed to negotiate with the hackers for the ransomware amount, they will actually, take a sizable portion of that. So if the hackers are maybe asking for 100,000, they may jump that up to 150,000 to increase their take, even though they're helping you to negotiate the deal. So again, be aware of that. And if you're in a hurry, you might end up getting into business or partner with maybe not the right group of people, et cetera. So it definitely plan it. It pays to plan ahead. So I just put some slides up just for information. What are the 10 most common ransomware variants? You notice Lisa mentioned Ryuk, which is down at number 7, and they've actually dropped off as of late. But one of the things that I want to show you real quick as we're looking at this is, since Ryuk was what Lisa had experience with, let's take a quick look at it. So let me stop sharing this and let me pull up my PowerPoint, and let me share my screen here real quick. So I came to a website called Joe's Sandbox, and I'm just using the free version here, but I typed in the search result for Ryuk. You notice they have several of the famous malwares at the top, like Imitet, et cetera. Imitet both as malware and malware as a service, I believe. So, but if we look at this, you can see the actual breakdown of the files. I find this helpful, and you can click here on the HTML for that particular file, and it's going to load this for us. And so as it loads it, you notice it gives you the type of analysis of the detection. It shows you the different signatures for this malware. You can actually click on the classification, and you can see here, a quick graph that shows you that it is used for ransomware, just as Lisa attested to. The ability to spread, and propagate once it's internal. It does have an ability to evade. So it can bypass OS protections, et cetera, and disable security settings. It uses anti-reversing tricks and anti-debugging tricks, and it obfuscates its behavior. Some of the evasion capabilities of these malware is very impressive, and I won't spend a lot of time on it, but some of them are able to detect if they're being scanned by a malware or antivirus, et cetera, to determine, and they'll actually change their fingerprint, if you will, so that they cannot be detected. I know Imitet had really strong capabilities at being able to do that. And that's what this evader capability has been able to show you. So many different characteristics and capabilities. Again, we won't go into all of these, but I wanted to quickly show you. Again, one of the things that I do like is you can come in to the MITRE attack matrix if you come under signature, and this will actually show you within MITRE what different the different capabilities, and we can click on them, and it'll show you, it'll bring it up, and it'll talk about what the what this specific malware is doing with respect to this part of the MITRE. You notice, and it spawns processes, et cetera. So it kind of gives you a good idea of how it's behaving. And speaking of that, we can come over here to the behavior, and you can actually come down, and it gives you a very detailed list of the actual behavior itself, and show you that. So it'll actually show you too, geographically where it's, where it's predominant. And I was going to show, this will show you statistics, and it shows you for the different file and just different characteristics of it that you can look at in order to determine the different executables, if you will, out of this malware. And again, if we come down to the behavior, and I wanted to show, let me go back to the top. If I come back to overview, I do want to show you the behavior graph. This is really interesting because this actually graphically depicts for you. You can see over here the legend for process signatures, created files, etc. But this actually depicts for you, and I'm trying to blow it up a little bit bigger, what this particular tst test.exe file, you notice it is a Windows, it's behaving on Windows, but what it's doing and how it's doing it. So, you can see down here around multiple AV scanners, etc. And then we can continue to come on down, and you can see all the other files that it's dropping, and then just how it's continuing to behave. So I like this because it gives you a graphical view of how this specific malware executable is behaving. And I find that that's helpful. So I just wanted to show you this. I know this is getting pretty technical. And so my goal here was just to show that there are capabilities on the internet where they've analyzed a lot of this malware and they've broken it down, and you can show how it behaves, etc. And I think that could be beneficial for you. So I'm going to stop sharing that. We're going to jump back over to our PowerPoint. So again, moving on. So what are the different attack vectors? Again, just as Lisa was talking about with the emails that were utilized, email phishing is a big one, software vulnerability, and of course, remote desktop protocol, which is a Windows, and you can see that it's actually on the downward trend, and we'll look at that. But if you look at the different ransomware malwares, these are three of the top ones, you can see that they use different capabilities. One of the things is I'll hear people talking about email phishing, etc., and that's what they're focused on. But understand, other malwares are going to focus on software vulnerabilities, etc. As I mentioned at the beginning, there is no silver bullet for this. The malware is going to continue to evolve. And in order to do that, you're going to have to also evolve your data protections. So, and this just shows different vulnerabilities used for different size organizations. And here is by industry, which is pretty disturbing if you ask me, because if you look over there on the right-hand side in the light blue is healthcare at 11.6%. So it's tied with public sector. How unfortunate that they would target healthcare, but that's what they've been doing. And professional services is the top one that they target. One of the things I'll tell you here is that there's clear evidence, just like Lisa was talking about, where they lay in wait within your systems. They actually look at your 10Ks, they listen to the earnings reports, things like that, and they wait for the most inopportune time to strike. For instance, if you look at transportation up there on the top left in the green, most of y'all, you may not be aware, but over Thanksgiving week, that is the busiest week for booking travel that the airlines have all year. So it wouldn't surprise you that right before Thanksgiving week, you get notified of a ransomware attack, because what you would be willing to pay that week would most likely be greater than at other weeks. Same thing for retail, right? That's one of the biggest shopping times of the year. So be aware of that, just like Lisa was saying, that they waited until they took out, potentially, they took out the cyber insurance policy and then they struck. So be aware that they are going to wait for the most opportune time for them, which will be the most inopportune time potentially for you. And this just shows the number of attacks by month. And of course, goes through, the green goes through May of 2021. The blue is in 2020. So to kind of finish up on the trends, more attacks with increased disruption, just like we were talking about. And they're hitting supply chains. We saw that with the supply chain attack for SolarWinds coming through in patch software. More disruptive attacks, even against the cloud. So you have to be diligent, not just for on premises, for the cloud as well. IoT systems are very much at risk. Artificial intelligence is, it's a great thing, but it can be also used for nefarious purposes. And then biometric data, of course, they'd love to get their hands on that as well. So just real quickly, one of the things I want to cover is we talked about the timing of attacks being opportune for the hackers. But if you think that ransomware is the worst thing that can happen, I would tend to argue with that. The worst that I've seen in my 25 years here covering cybersecurity at Oracle is data manipulation. I used to work in the energy sector, and I actually observed an energy company whose petroleum reservoir data, where someone had infiltrated that system and was able to change the data within that reservoir system. And in doing so, caused this energy company to make inappropriate estimates and bids on potential properties. And the competitor, which was another country that had done it, was able to take advantage of that. So, you can imagine the type of money that that would equate to. And the only way that they were able to identify that the data had been altered was, unfortunately, they did not have auditing turned down at a level that they probably should have and were analyzing it. And secondly, to detect it. And so they realized when their estimates were not coming in accurately on these properties or on the reservoirs, they realized something was wrong. Another is malicious. Actually, worked with the FBI, et cetera, around working with a company that made medical devices, and a terrorist organization was working to infiltrate the database that handled the data for these medical devices. And if that data had been altered, you could have potentially been able to kill someone with those devices that were embedded in them. So our FBI does way more behind the scenes than anyone knows. And I've ceased to be amazed at some of their capabilities and what they're able to prevent. And just understand that, sometimes people's lives do hang in the balance on this. And there really are some unbelievably nefarious actors, both from a competitive standpoint, as well as terrorist organizations. So these could be even more damaging, I believe, than even a ransomware attack. So let's look at, but we are talking about ransomware, so let's look at it in action. So how does a modern ransomware work? Well, let's take a look. So you basically have initial attacking vector, phishing emails, which we've talked about, et cetera, and coming in from a command and control center, and then those getting into the victim's PC, just like Lisa had referred to, then coming over and enumerating, which means propagating through your system with Active Directory, different listeners, etc., making its way through your systems. And then obviously getting into the storage systems, infecting your backups. Luckily, as Lisa talked about, Linux being a different operating system than the Windows kept that from being an issue for them. And then accessing and corrupting databases, such as dropping all database tables, doing database tampering, changing records, which is just what we were just talking about. So this kind of gives you an overview picture just as a sample of how it works. And we're going to talk about in a minute on how to work to mitigate this threat. But at the storage layer, you know, the ransomware, again, it can be dormant. You see it work its way up into the network attached storage. Once it hits storage, it works to find other storage systems to hit. Any process running on the operating system, it could see and change those files. And again, it works to write operations with admin privileges. We're going to talk about that. It's very important to use least privilege with administrator privileges. And there's a lot of capabilities within the systems and databases to be able to provide that least privilege access. That's one of the areas, quite honestly, I've seen a lot of organizations not as diligent in as they need to be. And believe me, the hackers are after those administrator privileges. And administrators, it used to be that you did not know who they were for an organization. Now you can specifically target them just with a LinkedIn account. You can find out normally who are the administrators that work for a specific organization. If it does get those administrative privileges, well, look out, because everything will look legit. We've actually seen them turn off auditing. In the SolarWinds Orion incident, it appears that they actually were able to turn off multi-factor authentication. So, you know, obviously with those privileges, you can do a lot. And then again, it scans for storage OS binaries and tries to put payloads there as well. So let's look at the backups. So, you know, also at first stage, infecting the data sets, using command and control to try brute force attacks, again, trying to gain admin access to the backup servers, and then being able to shut down those backup services. So, and that's what you're visually seeing here is as we walk through it. And then what about at the database layer? We've talked about the backups and the storage, but what about the database? Well, a search payload is deployed after compromise. It does a reconnaissance to look for database listeners on the network. I'm going to show you an example of this in a minute. Once it finds one, it opens a port with a command and control server. And attackers then attempt brute force or user password combinations to get those admin accesses that we keep talking about. And lastly, attempting database file encryption. So that's know thy enemy. So that's kind of a long section. These next ones will not take quite as long. So how do you, now that we understand how the ransomware works, we've got a good feel for that, how it attacks, how it propagates, etc. How do you go about assessing your environment? And again, know yourself and you will win all battles. I hope that's true. So again, just to look real quick, again, to set the stage, looking at the security snapshot, obviously you're looking at, yes, the different layers of perimeter and network and endpoint security, application, data security, etc. Don't forget about policy. That's where you can be proactive and reactive in monitoring and response and recovery. And we're going to be talking about those. So as I mentioned at the beginning, the CISA does have, allows for you to assess your environment. So they provide risk and vulnerability assessments. They also provide cyber hygiene assessments and phishing assessments, as well as an ICS assessment. If you notice at the bottom, all these services are available at no cost to federal agencies, state and local governments, critical infrastructure, and private organizations generally. They do give you the assessment scripts to run, and they will even normally provide you some assistance in being able to run those and interpret the results, et cetera. So this is a great way for you to be able to assess your environment. And again, out of their risk and vulnerability assessment, I pulled this diagram which shows that they're laying it out as far as the criticality of the finding, being critical, high, medium, and low, and looking at, of course, the different areas, network, penetration, phishing, web application, operating system, and database. And this just gives you an example also out of their risk and vulnerability assessment. This is just a sample of different things that they can find, such as SQL injection, which they categorized as critical, application logic, denial of service, etc. So they give you a pretty good idea, both external, internal. You notice we talked about administrative passwords. They've, obviously given that high, easily guessable credentials, patch management, etc. So next we're going to go into the frameworks, but before I do, let me launch another poll question real quick. So this is just a quick poll. If you don't mind filling it out, we're just trying to gather information, and I'll share the results with everybody so you can see it, because it kind of gives us an idea of where each other is with respect to our ability to detect and contain an incident, et cetera. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll really quick. I'll give you just a few more seconds if you'd like to put your vote in. Okay, and in the poll, and let me share the results. So pretty much a medium level for the ability to identify a cyber criminal within the network and detect it and contain the incident. So I think that was what I was estimating, but you notice low is almost equal to the ones that are high. So so the majority of people came out in the medium quartile. Let me as we talked about assessing, I have a question on assessing here I'd like to pose to you. So have you taken, have you implemented an employee awareness training to help protect against ransomware attacks? I'm interested in this one to see how many organizations or how many people that are attending have observed that. And when I send out if you've asked for a copy of the presentation materials, et cetera, when I send those out, I will send a copy of the poll results out with it as well. Okay, let's end it. Let's share the results. So roughly 80% said yes, 14% said no, and 6% are not sure. So, and let me ask one more, and then we'll get on to the next section. because this one is important because it's actually going over what we're going over, which is assessments. So does your organization conduct regular risk assessments to identify and remediate vulnerabilities that could lead to a ransomware attack? Since we just talked about assessing the environment and that the US government does have complementary assessments that you can utilize. I know many of you already have SIM tools and other things that you're utilizing to analyze your environment, but just wanted to get a feel for how many people. Let me end the poll there and share the results. So 63% said yes, 13% said no, and 24% are not sure. So I think we would all agree, and I'm not trying to make the nose, I appreciate y'all being honest, but if you're not assessing your environment, being that there's one of these attacks occurring every 11 seconds, it could, you're definitely playing I think a very risky game at that point. So, and if you are assessing the environment, then the question becomes, how well is it assessed, right? And so let's talk about that. Let's look at some of the best practices, if you will, and the frameworks. So I like this saying from Sun Tzu, strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory. Tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. I felt like this was a good slide to put right before the frameworks because regardless what framework you use, it helps give you a strategy. So again, we showed when I went out to Joe's Sandbox, I showed the MITRE mapping. One of the things I want to point out here is many of the vendors, I know at Oracle we've done this, we've mapped over capabilities, control capabilities for the different MITRE matrix quadrants. So lean on your vendors, your operating system, the database, the application, et cetera. Lean on them to help you understand what are the controls that you have if you're using the MITRE attack matrix. What are the controls that you're using for that specific matrix? And secondly is NIST. NIST has many resources available. We're going to be showing some of these and kind of their best practices. They work hand in hand with the CISA, which is again the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Utilize these NIST guidelines. CISA actually has their mappings for their best practices, et cetera, over to the NIST framework and to the MITRE attack matrix as well. So that may be helpful to you as well. But there's some very good frameworks out here. And again, I'd be negligent not to mention frameworks like ISACA's COBIT, framework, which can also be very helpful. And there's, a multitude of other frameworks out there, ISO, et cetera, that you might want to utilize to help ensure that where do I have gaps when you do the assessment and what are the potential controls, et cetera, I could utilize. And I just put this up. This was actually something that, I'd worked up at Oracle for a customer. They were dealing with the NIST privacy framework and mapping it over to some select Oracle products that they had. And again, I just put this in here. I'm not trying to plug Oracle. I'm just trying to show that lean on your vendors to help give you input as to where to leverage what different technologies that you currently have from them. That's what we're trying to say here is, like I said, we're all in this together and we want to help each other. So that's on the control frameworks. Now we're going to get into what are the ransomware mitigation best practices. I believe if I was to tell you that that was coming from me, that'd be a little disingenuous. I think the CISA is much more capable of saying what the best practices are for ransomware. So when you look at the CISA, you can group these into 5 different categories, if you will: assessing the environment, vulnerability management, segmenting, maintain and monitor, and backup and disaster recovery. And within those categories, you can see the exact verbiage that they're using to talk about it. So let's look at the one on the top left. Conduct regular vulnerability scanning and address vulnerabilities. Well, do you remember that poll I just put up that a few people said no? Well, they're saying that that's a best practice and you need to be able to hopefully be able to do that. Under vulnerability management at the top, use multi-factor authentication for all services to the extent possible. I'm almost afraid of using the term zero trust because it's such a buzzword right now after the SolarWinds Orion breach. But yes, multi-factor authentication is important to utilize. And as well as you notice under that, apply the principle of least privilege to all systems and services. I wish I could double emphasize that one from my experience, because that one really is a key. Make no mistake, they want the most powerful credentials within your organization. And so the more you can limit those, the better. And we'll talk about ways that you can really easily do that. Segmenting, employ logical or physical means of network segmentation. You know, that may be easier said than done if your current data center's not segmented via the network. You might want to look to a cloud provider that has network segmentation. Maybe for your critical systems, you might want to lean on, maybe it makes sense to move it out of your data center if there's a capability in the cloud, such as network segmentation, et cetera, that you would be able to utilize that could better help you maintain the availability of that system and resist an attack. Maintain and monitor, no surprise, regularly patch and update software. Again, we'll talk about this, but the ability to patch in a timely manner, we saw the statistic about 85% of attacks took place on known vulnerabilities. So also notice underneath that, ensure devices are properly configured. And as Lisa and I discussed at the beginning, make sure that those are backed up, that those configurations, and that you can recover those. Listen, that is as important as backing up the data, is ensure that your configurations are also backed up and that you can quickly deploy new VM images, et cetera, for both desktops as well as, most importantly, for your critical servers. And it's important to know, to be able to assure the health of those. As Lisa mentioned, they were fortunate that the operating system prevented the Ryuk malware from infecting their backups due to the Linux operating system and the segmenting that was occurring there. But ensure that, if it does get infected, you'll need a method to know what is a healthy configuration and what is an unhealthy one. Because remember, they lay in wait for a good while, and a lot of times they are changing DLLs, executables, etc. They are changing files within your system. So you need to go back to a point in time that you know where it was a healthy, clean configuration. And then, of course, we're going to focus on the backup and disaster recoveries, maintaining offline encrypted backups of data and regularly test your backups. Can't stress that enough about testing them. Have GOAT images of critical systems. Again, this is the GOAT images here. They're talking about the configurations, everything related to that system for both the operating system, the applications, et cetera, and obviously retain applicable source code executables. So we've walked through assessing the environment, looking at the frameworks, looking at best practices, and now lastly, we're going to look at a case study over prevention, detection, and recovery. So what are some specific controls that you could employ? So again, I throw this best practices document up, and I'm going to use Oracle here as our case study. Couple of reasons I'm using that. One, I've been here with Oracle 25 years, so I know a lot of our controls, et cetera, and my job is to help customers do a lot of what we're talking about today. But secondly, Oracle is a good study case because they cover everything from storage to hardware to operating system to databases to application servers to applications and even the cloud. And so they're one of the few vendors that does that. And I wanted to to be able to highlight a lot of those different capabilities for y'all today. That being said, I understand you'll have different technologies. You may not even have Oracle. That's okay. If you understand the concepts of what we're talking about on the controls, you can lean on those, on your technology vendors to help you in these different areas. And that's the point that we're trying to get across. So as an example, if you looked at, and this is just to serve as an example, your specific controls that you might deploy might be different than this. But if you looked at a critical system and you were looking at Oracle technology, let's say here we're talking about in your own data center, if you will, there's a lot of different capabilities that you can see here. And these are actually, hyperlinks, so you can, if you're not familiar with it, you can find out more information about it, et cetera. But the goal of this, again, is just to give you an idea of the different capabilities around assessment and the different categories. So let's talk about that real quick. The Oracle has a database security assessment tool. This is a complimentary free tool. It aligns with the CISA findings of the critical, high, medium, and low. It uses the US DISA STIGs in order to categorize the findings. And the important thing is it goes by database version. So one, this is free for you to download out of Oracle support if you have an Oracle database. And I believe, just FYI, I think Microsoft has a similar one for SQL Server, et cetera. So again, I'm not trying to make a commercial, if you will. I'm trying to be helpful in things that you can utilize to extend the CISA assessments. So the CISA assessments are good, but at the same time, they're generic. If you'd like to extend that, such as with the database security assessment tool, it will tell you by that specific version what the configurations are, what the controls that are enabled and which ones are not enabled, and where potential gaps may lie. DataSafe does that as well for Oracle databases in the cloud, as well as in your own data center as well. And it will do continuous monitoring of that as well. And Database Lifecycle Management Pack also can help you monitor what patches have been applied, et cetera. If you're running, for instance, Oracle hardware like Exadata, there's a capability called Oracle ExaCheck that will actually analyze the hardware and and it's complementary, very similar to what DBSAT does for the database. It does it for the hardware and the operating system so that you can analyze that. And if we come back up to the previous slide, it's talking about conduct regularly vulnerability scanning and addressing. So that's exactly what we're doing here. And my point is, again, these, DBSAT and Oracle ExaCheck, et cetera, those are complementary tools that you can utilize, to help you assess your environment and give you more clarification on top of the CISA assessments. Again, I've broken this out in prevention, detection, and recovery, because that's what we're looking at. How do we try to prevent an intrusion? If we do suffer an intrusion, how do we detect it quickly? And at the bottom, how do we recover from it as fast as possible? And so these are different controls that you could utilize for these different categories that the CISA has laid out as far as best practices. So I won't go through these in detail, but I wanted to highlight these for you. And again, you would plug in your own controls from your own technology vendors here, but I do think it's important to tie back to the CISA's best practices and lay it out as far as what is a preventative, what's a detection, and what is a recovery control. And some controls, you'll notice, for instance, under segment, we have Key Vault up there as a preventative control, but we also have it down as a recovery control as well. Controls can participate in more than just one category, of course. So it can be a one-to-many relationship so that you understand where its contributions are within the matrix. Next would be like cloud. And again, this just gives you a different visibility into if you were, for instance, using the Oracle Cloud. And again, this would vary whether it was IaaS or PaaS, Platform as a Service, or Software as a Service. So you would fill this out accordingly. But just to give you an overall example, of different preventative controls, detective controls, and recovery controls that you could utilize in that Oracle Cloud system to help you. And again, if you're using a SaaS application, through Oracle or through Salesforce, et cetera, lean on that cloud vendor to help you fill this out for what are the controls that are available for you to use in these different CISA best practice categories. And then are you using them or not? And that way you're aware of which ones am I using and which ones should I look to. And again, just to go back, the CISA breaks these findings out. And I wanted to just quickly show for instance, for DBSAT, which is, again, it's a free tool you can utilize. Here's an example of it where it breaks out for your specific database environment. What are the critical, high, medium, and low? You notice that ties right back to CISA. And the nice thing about those delegations is that's not an Oracle opinion. That's driven by the US government on their DISA STIGs. They go through each version of the database. They do it for Oracle, they do it for SQL Server, they do it for DB2, but DBSAT will help you highlight what are the findings and what is their delegation of criticality based on, or severity, I should say, based on the finding according to the US government. And that way you know how to prioritize these, right? So again, you also get a barometer that helps you lay this out. And then if you remember earlier when we looked at the Ryuk capability that Lisa mentioned, it talked about listeners potentially being compromised. And so here's an actual finding out of DBSAT. I just provided this as an example that, that the risk here is the database may not be protected from a TNS listener poison attack. It lists the common vulnerability enumeration that it relates to, and then it tells you the impact of this, and then if the vulnerability, what versions of the database it may exist in, and also it lists what the potential remediation for this could be. And that way you can go to the support notes and find out further information on how to further remediate this. And it even gives you an estimate on the quantifying the severity and maybe even the time and the complexity. Clearly that varies by organization, but I just wanted to show this because, again, this is a complementary tool that you can utilize, and the different IT vendors have these. And if you're not using these and leaning on your IT vendors to help you with this right now, you should be. And that's one of the main things I want to leave everybody with today is, again, we're all in this together. Lean on your IT vendors to help you. Lean on the frameworks from MITRE, from ISACA, from NIST, et cetera, and ISO to help you on clarifying what you need to do, and lean on the CISA for the assessments and the prioritization of best practices. This is just a quick screenshot of DataSafe. Again, it does continuous monitoring, but I get asked a lot of times about security assessment for a database, user assessment, data discovery. It even helps you identify what sensitive data exists within a database, how much of that data exists, et cetera. You can see the administrator activity, et cetera. And to that point, one of the things I want to mention is the database does have a capability called Database Vault that allows you to limit the administrator capabilities within a database. And not only can it do that, but it can do it dynamically. So if a DBA was to log in remotely versus locally within the network, it can apply different security policies. And maybe it doesn't, if you're dialing in from home, of course, that's been different this year with COVID, of course, but, or even dialing in out of the country, it could limit you on not being able to see specific, like personal identifiable information or intellectual property capabilities. You'd still be able to maintain the database, start and stop it, et cetera. And it's analogous to a valet key for your car. I did not know this until I became married about 28 years ago. I would just take my car to the mechanic and just give them all of my keys to my house and everything, hand those over to the mechanic while they worked on my car. My wife educated me that you shouldn't do that. You should give them the valet key and only to the car. And the valet key allows you to start and stop the car. You can drive the car and test drive it. So a mechanic can do everything they need to do. What they can't do is they cannot get in the glove compartment and they cannot get in the trunk of the car. So, it helps keep some of your information. And yeah, you have to ask normally, why would a mechanic need in your glove compartment or in the trunk of your car, right? And so if it's not needed, don't give them the access. And so ever since my wife alerted me of that, I've utilized that. Well, the database has the same capability, right? It can apply a valet key even to powerful administrators, and it can be driven off of, again, it could apply it at all times. It can drive it off of time of day or attributes such as what IP address subnet you're coming in from, therefore what geography, et cetera. So just keep that in mind. There's a lot of capabilities. That capability is built in right into the Oracle database. All you have to do is enable it. So these are capabilities, and had the organizations, with SolarWinds Orion, it used a administrator logon to the Oracle database and to other databases in order to do its monitoring that it wanted to do. There was no need, even though it wanted to monitor the database, it did not need to be able to actually see your sensitive data within that database. It did not need to be able to make configuration changes to that database, et cetera. So you can lock that down and limit that access. And hopefully one of the things you take away with you today is that's just kind of a best practice for being able to do that. So again, there's a tremendous amount of capabilities you could utilize. I want to, again, blockchain is another one. A lot of people are not aware that, databases have blockchain capabilities within them, and you can use them. And with those blockchain capabilities, it doesn't keep your data necessarily from being stolen, but it does provide an additional layer of defense that can keep that data from being changed. And I really wanted to highlight this because, as I mentioned earlier on in the presentation, I believe, yes, ransomware is bad, but I think the worst attacks that I've observed over the years is when data is actually altered and you're not aware of it. And there's nothing to alert you to that. And decisions are made off of bad data at that point, or even nefarious activities are conducted off of that bad data. So please be aware of that. And this is just one more mechanism that you could utilize to help you. Also, we talked a lot about software, but there is capabilities such as hardware for storage. So, here we're talking about a database, and you can work to utilize, for instance, move unstructured data into your databases. Try to limit the number of different data repositories that you have. Those can basically, it's difficult to keep all of those patched, etc. So if you can keep those limited, encrypt that information, again, manage your privileged credentials. I always equate this to, if you go to a bank, they normally have one safe deposit area within the bank. They don't have 3 or 4 at that branch. So there's a reason for that, right? It's easier to protect the one particular area. And let me move on to, this will actually talk about the hardware that you can use for backups. So here we're using the Zero Data Loss Recovery Appliance as just an example. And this recovery appliance, I wanted to share with you some of the capabilities that you can look at to help mitigate. And again, as we talked about, the hackers continue to get more sophisticated. They continue to try to propagate their information, and they absolutely want to hit your backups. And it's important to store backups offline, but just like Lisa talked about, 4 hours of lost records, you imagine if that was, Amazon, right? And 4 hours of, or a retailer, or, JCPenney, or, any large retailer, that could be an immense number of systems or records. So this just gives you an idea where the Zero Data Loss Recovery Appliance, it's actually somewhat becomes invisible, makes it very difficult for malware to find it and identify it and know how to compromise it. And this just gives you a further example of that. All I'm trying to highlight here is that there are hardware capabilities, there's operating system capabilities, there are software, database, applications, etc., that you can utilize to help mitigate these threats. And again, you'll need to assess your environment. And we talked about CISA potentially helping you do that, or whatever you're using to do it. And then lean on your technology vendors to help you understand how to enable that. And so, again, this one just talks about being able to camouflage it, secure your boot mask, obfuscate via an internal firewall, and basically help make your backup almost invisible, if you will, from a malware provider. So with that, we get into the definitions, and I've posted these out on chat. And again, they'll be in the presentation. I also have some additional slides that I didn't have a chance to cover today. We went over an hour and a half as it was, so my apologies for that. We took an hour and a half to go through this, but it is a very serious subject and one that requires a lot of time to go through to do it justice. So I hope this session was informative. I hope you enjoyed Lisa sharing her experience, and I'll quickly look to Q&A. Again, if you do need to drop, you can do that, and you're welcome to drop if needed, and you'll still get CPE credit. But I will go to the Q&A and see what all different questions we have. So we have several questions. I'm just going to hit a couple of them. Could mitigating data manipulation include encrypting data at rest and data in transit? Yes, encryption can help you provide mitigation from certain ransomware attacks. I'm not going to say, again, it's not a silver bullet. It may not be able to mitigate all ransomware attacks, but it can be helpful in helping you mitigate certain attacks that are not able to encrypt if that data is already encrypted. One of the also main things it helps you do too, and remember we talked about this at the beginning, was to talk about there's a dual ransomware threat, if you will. Not only do they keep you from accessing your system data, but they also hit you with a ransomware threat they want you to pay a fee to keep them from releasing your data. So one, you'll have to pay a fee for being able to get the decryption key to unencrypt your data and get your systems back up and running. But they'll also want to provide, they'll want you to provide a ransom so that they don't release your private data publicly. And therefore, especially with the EU's GDPR, now the CPRA and HIPAA, et cetera, put you in violation of certain regulation or regulations where you could also, have fines levied against you as well. Not to mention potential competitors being able to access that data and system. So hopefully that helps. I know we've gone over on time, so I'm going to go ahead and conclude it here. I hope this was helpful for you. And like I said, I'll work to answer the remaining questions as we send email responses to everybody that asked. I will put up one more time the polling question, just in case you didn't answer it at the beginning. If you would like to receive a copy of the presentation today, and if you want a link to the recording, and we'll be glad to send that to you. So I don't want to send materials or emails to people that don't want them. I know I get plenty as it is. And but if you would like a copy of the presentation, like I said, we have a lot of links to the CISA, the NIST resources, et cetera. I'm happy to provide that to you, and as well as give you a link to the webinar that we'll be posting on our private channel on YouTube. But again, hopefully this was helpful. I tried to cover as quick as I could, or as quick as I had hoped to. Controls in the cloud, controls on premises, and all the way from hardware through software. We did not cover processes and procedures today. That's kind of outside of the scope of this webinar, because we're talking about automated controls today. For manual controls, we'll look to have another webinar that will talk about processes and procedures that you can do for manual controls, if you will, to be proactive. So, but with that, thank you everybody for coming. I really appreciate it. And we'll look forward to seeing you on our next webinar. Thank you.